Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. I am joined once again, magic jazz fingers. Oh, I am not joined. Yes, I am. I am joined by Amy Hollenkamp. Those of you not on YouTube, she just went off camera for a second. It was beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah,
Dan.
thank you.
I'm joined by
the people.
Amy Hollenkamp, RD to the stars. I don't know which stars, but I'm assuming that one of your clients is eventually going to become a star or is already an existing star, or they're stars in our eyes, and that's what matters most. I'm Nikki. I think I fell out of the habit of introducing myself again for the umpteenth time, but that's okay. We're back on the wagon. We're modeling imperfection for the people here, and you pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you do it again. So I'm going to get back in the habit of introducing myself. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about LIBO. My darling, my sweet, for the people who might not know what this acronym stands for, can you maybe just preface this with what is LIBO and why would we call it LIBO? I think the term LIBO is a relatively new term, but what are we differentiating it from when we say the term LIBO?
Yeah, so LIBO is an acronym for large intestinal bacterial overgrowth, similar to SIBO. I oftentimes think it's the go-to diagnosis when the breath test, which we all know, again, has so many issues, comes back negative, and the provider's like, well, must be LIBO, or your stool test looked off, must be LIBO and not SIBO. But yeah, I do think it can come with a lot of the same symptoms. Again, if you have an imbalanced large intestine, it can come with similar symptoms to SIBO. I mean, with a little bit of nuance, but yeah, I think to me, it's sort of this diagnosis that comes in if SIBO is not present and the provider's just like, well, must be LIBO. It feels like that to me a lot of the time.
Yeah, I could see that. I think that there's probably two ways that you could wind up with such a diagnosis. And I'm going to use the term diagnosis really loosely here.
Right.
I think you're right that when the breath test comes back negative, and frankly, the practitioner is kind of grasping at straws, trying to give you a valid reason why you feel like crap, pun intended, then it's like, oh, well, if it's not SIBO, it must be LIBO. I think also you could arrive at this diagnosis via stool testing, and that would be fairly reasonable to do. But I feel like if the vehicle is stool testing, I think that most practitioners are still going to call it dysbiosis.
Yeah.
Versus calling it LIBO.
Say that. Yep.
And I think that we need to differentiate just a teeny bit, because if we're going based off of the name and what it implies, there is going to be a little bit of difference there. I think that LIBO could be a variation of dysbiosis, right? So dysbiosis is just the imbalance between the good guys and the bad guys in an ecosystem. That could be fungi, it could be bacteria, which is what we're talking about predominantly today. It could be parasites, it could be viruses, it could be any sort of critters. But the last two letters of this acronym, bacterial overgrowth, imply that the overall quantity of bacteria is elevated. So who knows? You could have an elevation of the bad guys and the good guys. It's just globally, you have a lot more bacteria in your colon than we would suspect.
Right. Is there can you have an overabundance of bacteria in your large intestines? You're supposed to have a bunch of bacteria in there.
See, and that's part of the problem with this so-called diagnosis is I don't know if I believe that LIBO really exists, to tell you the truth. I think that dysbiosis does, but I don't know if we could really say that you have a colon-based bacterial overgrowth and that the overall quantity of bacteria is too much for the colon to handle. That's kind of, it's not its entire job, but that's 90% of the colon's job, is to be like a frat house for your bacteria. So I don't know if we can really overwhelm it, and I don't know mechanisms by which we would overwhelm that capacity. So I don't know if I'm really a LIBO believer necessarily. Again, I think that oftentimes this is brought up as kind of a grasping for straws. Oh, it's not SIBO. We need to give it another sexy, fancy name kind of thing.
Yeah, we're coming in hot, I feel like, right out the gate. Right out the gate,
I
we're
know,
coming in hot.
5 minutes in, and we're like, we don't believe in this.
Right. Well, and it's weird because the verbiage is just off in general, but I do think that maybe the practitioner understands what they're trying to say is you have too much of proteobacteria or too much of a certain type of bacteria that might not be you want to have around. Like, so I think that some practitioners might be thinking more in a dysbiosis way, like, oh, they have too much of this sketchy bacteria and we're labeling it LIBO. But the problem is that a lot of the patients interpret it differently and interpret it almost in the same lens as SIBO, where it is just something that needs to be killed and cleared
Nuked.
and beaten down because you have all this bacteria, and it becomes a very kill the bug mentality. The bugs are against you mentality.
Well, it turns into the infection model, right?
Right. Exactly.
Like, oh my God, you
Exactly.
have an infection, you have an overgrowth, we have to kill the infection, you need antibiotics or whatever it might be. And I agree. I think that probably if we were to have these conversations with most practitioners, I feel like most people would start kind of naturally having a conversation more in line with dysbiosis rather than what LIBO implies. Here's something else too. I wonder, and I'm gonna actually kick this to you because I need to be careful how much I throw this one under the bus. We have talked about this before, both I think on screen, but certainly you and I have talked about this off screen many times. That stool test collection at home is still an evolving science, and we are both of the opinion that the lab company should be standardizing or normalizing or somehow controlling for the amount of stool in the cup. And do you want to, you know what I'm talking about, right? You want to share with me? So you had shared that you and Armand had both done a GI map at some point within the last year or two. You take it away. I'm not going to steal
Right.
your thunder.
Yeah. Well, this is something it's such a weird dilemma because I've gotten mixed messages from them. And again, like, but basically what happened was Armand and I both did a GI map. This had to be like right when we had gotten married. So maybe like 3 years ago or something, or 2.5 years ago. And I remember Armand, so they have a line on the bottle where it's like, where you're, again, to me, I thought it had to be precise, but I think you're supposed to fill it up to that line. And so that's kind of what I did. I filled it exactly to the line. Whereas Armand shoved so much poop in his thing, it was like to the brim. And again, I was
Go big or go home.
I know. I was like, Armand, like, what are you doing? You didn't need to put that much in there. And he's like, well, you know, whatever. And then it just made me think the same amount of solution is in there. And like, he has more poop in there and I had less poop. And I was like, how's this going to turn out? And this is just between our two samples. So again, if someone could explain this to me, I would love to understand how this can happen. But his test was like lit up like a Christmas tree. Everything was high.
Everything high.
It made me really wonder. And mine was generally fairly low because I filled everything up to the brim. So I didn't really have anything high. Everything was kind of low to, like, if anything, things were registering as low, which made me wonder, and again, this is just based off our two samples, how does the amount of stool being used affect the test? I'd have to think it affects it some way. I know in the Diagnostic Solutions manual, it says they control per, I don't know, some amount of stool, but then the company has responded with a different suggestion of what's going on. But I don't know how you can control with stool if you're using the same solution. Like the solution to poop ratio is still going to be off, even if you use the same amount of the sample. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
you get what I'm saying.
I don't think it's coincidental that Armand filled his cup to the brim. He had an increased quantity of poop in the cup, and that his test results showed an increased quantity of darn near everything they tested, versus here you are filling it just perfectly to the line, and hardly anything came back flagged as elevated on yours. I really feel like this is something that the company should explore further, and they should have a better answer. Because if I remember correctly, they didn't really have a great answer for you when you reached out with this conundrum. I don't remember exactly what they said at the time.
Yeah, so again, like here's what it says. I looked up the interpretive guide. So it says, results are reported as colony forming units per gram of stool. But again, like, they're somewhat controlling for amount, but you can't really control for the ratio between, like, the solution. That's what I get a little confused about.
Yeah, well, and I wonder, too, the solution serves a purpose. And I think with a lot of these DNA-based tests, I think that the solution is killing the microbes and kind of suspending it in time, versus if you were to just send the poop as is, some things would be growing and multiplying and some things would be dying off, and the ratios would be skewed by the time it got to the lab. So my understanding is that the solution is important for killing the microbes and kind of freezing it in that moment in time when it leaves your body. So like you said, if there's a lower ratio of fluid to fecal matter, that could potentially throw this off, even if they are trying to account for
like certain bugs were growing
material
for longer.
Yeah. So I think there's probably several mechanisms by which that could be thrown off. And I'm willing to admit, maybe it's a fluke, right? Like maybe this is an N equals 2 experiment. And if we did this with many more people, maybe we would find that, the lab is controlling this well. I don't know. The point is, I think that this should fall on the lab to really like study this and really understand what's going on here. And it doesn't seem like they've done a great job of that. And I will say, I don't think that they're alone in this. I think that the same kind of issues could happen with just about any other stool test if you fill it up too much, or if you send in too much stool relative to the medium that you're mixing it with. So, well, I think that this is a problem inherent with stool testing.
Right, and that's one of the arguments that they have with split sample type testing is, you need the same amount of stool. And I'm like, well, people aren't doing the same amount of stool across time. That's the frustrating part. There's going to be so much user error then if you need the exact amount of stool. And I could see, again, with each sample, but again, no one's going to be doing the exact right amount of stool. And it just makes you wonder, like you said, is it throwing off the ability of the solution to sort of kill things and suspend them in time? But yeah, it leads to kind of interesting questions for sure.
We're getting tangled in a couple of potential topics. And I think that we fleshed it out mostly for the purpose of this conversation, but I want to say there's the accuracy question, and then there's the clinical utility question, right? So theoretically, any lab, we could be talking about Genova, we could be talking about doctor's data, we could be talking about Ombre, whatever. There's always the question of, if we have a known sample with, known ratios of these microbes, and we do a test repeatedly from this company, is it going to spit back fairly consistent results?
Right.
Based off what we know. And there was I forget if it was a peer-reviewed piece of literature or if it was not, I think it might have been a white paper, but I think it was sponsored by Doctors Data, but they examined the GI map and they had a company send in stool samples that were knowingly spiked with known pathogens, and the GI map did not pick up on those. So there's that issue. So there's the accuracy thing of if we spike the sample with chlamydia, or why would it be chlamydia? Oh my God, where's my brain today? Campylobacter. That's what I was trying to go for. If you have chlamydia in your stool sample, you're in real big trouble, people. Right. I don't know what else to tell you. Wow, that was a brain fart. But if we spike the sample intentionally with Giardia or E. coli or Shigella or Campylobacter or whatever, there's the accuracy issue of, is this lab going to correctly identify this 100% of the time? And are they going to correctly tell people who do not have these things that they tested negative, right? So it's like sensitivity versus specificity we're getting into. There's this whole other Pandora's box to open up, which is, even if it's accurate or not, is the test clinically useful? And does it provide useful information to the clinicians or the patients? That's a whole nother can of worms. But that's where we start getting into this. Like you said, by all means, if the following statement is incorrect and you're one of the people who have done this, please, for the love of God, put it in the YouTube comments because I want to meet you. I'm going to assume that nobody here who's ever done a stool test gets out like a kitchen scale and puts a little cup on the kitchen scale, and they're measuring out gram for gram how much poo they're putting in that little cup. Again, if you've done this with a kitchen scale, more power to you. Comment below. I really want to meet you. But most people wouldn't do that just because it's gross, not to mention it's kind of a pain in the butt. But, it's if the utility of your test hinges on that amount of precision that, frankly, normal people are not going to do, they're either not willing to do that or they're not capable of measuring it that accurately, then how useful is your test to the general public, right? Like if the requirements for getting a useful test from your company are that high, such that the average person is not going to meet those standards, then I would argue that makes your test not super clinically useful. But that's a whole nother can of worms. But I guess the point, to circle back to the initial intention of this conversation, is that I could see a scenario where somebody does a stool test and they get diagnosed with LIBO, quote unquote, because a whole bunch of stuff comes up elevated on a stool test. And that seems logical to diagnose that based off of that pattern, like what Armand had. Mm-hmm. But if there's no questioning or there's no attempt at controlling the quantity of stool that was tested, I don't know how accurate that diagnosis of LIBO actually is.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing is that depending on what the test is doing, like some of the testing is much more focused on looking at the general ecosystem and looking at how things are balanced in relation to other things. Whereas some tests like GI map, like some of the Genova, like some of the stool tests are going to be more focused on, let's look for the bad guys. So again, with some of the stuff, they're not necessarily assessing the whole microbiome. So you might have higher levels of certain microbes, but you might have lower levels of certain microbes. So again, like the overabundance issue is still problematic. And I think what people are labeling as LIBO, like we were saying earlier, is much more like, oh, you have a flavor of dysbiosis where there's potentially too high levels of certain microbes or opportunistic pathogens or like sketchier bugs, proteobacteria, stuff like that. Versus, again, there being just this insane overabundance of all the bacteria. But yeah, it's a to me, it's a weird. It was a really popular diagnosis, I feel like, for a while. I haven't heard it as much lately, but I do hear it again, like with different clients saying, oh, maybe it's not SIBO, maybe it's just LIBO. You're like, I don't know. Like, I don't think we can boil it down to something that simple. To me, the microbiome's so complex from an ecosystem standpoint. Like, I don't think it's usually just like too much bacteria. It's like, oh, there's higher levels of this one and maybe lower levels of this one. And, well, I don't know.
Even with SIBO, even with quote unquote SIBO now, we're starting to see holes poked in that hypothesis, even in the people who have an increased quantity of bacteria in the small intestine, which would be the diagnostic criteria for SIBO. Even in those people, when they examine the bacteria there, they're finding that it's a state of dysbiosis. The increased quantity is one part of the story, but that doesn't seem to correlate with symptom presentation really at all. But when they examine the actual makeup of the microbiota in the small intestine, they're seeing, yes, there's an increased quantity of some of the bad boogeymen like Klebsiella and E. coli, but there's also lower diversity and lower numbers of the good guys because those bad guys are crowding out the good guys. So even in SIBO, it's not a clear-cut bacterial overgrowth, end of story, it's a quantity issue kind of a thing. It's still a state of dysbiosis, which is why we've said before, really, we should rename SIBO to SIMD, which doesn't roll off the tongue nearly as well. But I really think it needs to be called small intestinal microbial dysbiosis instead of SIBO. I think that the SIBO acronym is inaccurate at this point. And again, that element of it doesn't seem to correlate with symptom presentation. SIMD does, at least as of the research, as of now in 2023. But going back to the LIBO idea, I think we've fairly well covered that LIBO...
Well, I have one other comment before we move on, if that's okay.
And
it's similar. I just wanted to sort of wrap up. I think what's crazy is both, again, the SIBO and LIBO are primarily more dysbiosis driven, like you were saying. Like, you could put labels, like label stuff all you want, but as you were saying before, the infection model has become so popular that the model of, oh, here's this like wicked one bug to go after, or this idea that you just need to clear. We basically oversimplified it in a lot of ways by labeling something as like an overgrowth, and just the overgrowth is the issue. When the microbiome's so vast and complex, and if one thing goes up, another thing goes down, and there's all this interaction. So in a lot of ways, I think the LIBO and SIBO model is oversimplified to be like an infection, and that's what unfortunately causes a lot of, I think it's what causes people to stay stuck, like we talk about all the time, because again, if you think it's an infection, you got to clear it and you got to starve it, and that's just not really what helps.
Yeah, I certainly not repeatedly.
Right.
I'm not intrinsically opposed to doing a little bit of clearing, and I know that you feel the same way. It's just, and I'm not opposed to using a diet like low FODMAP or SCD or something to mitigate and control symptoms for a short period of time. But this idea that it's like guerrilla warfare and you have to kill them and starve them and outsmart them, and it's us versus them, and it's infection, and oh my God, I have not seen that be fruitful for the majority of the people I work with.
That's correct for me as well.
And who knows, maybe it's like a sampling bias thing, because we tend to get the people who have tried the killing and starving, and we get the people who fail that route of treatment. So for all we know, maybe there are a boatload of people out there who kill and starve and it works really well for them. And then they are frolicking off into the rainbows with the unicorns, and they're having a grand old time, and they're able to eat whatever they want, and they totally heal their gut that way. It doesn't feel like that is a common truth from what I have seen. So it's a slippery slope to go down that road, because I think there's also a lot more fear with that, and a lot more fear mongering, intentional or otherwise, where the practitioner is scaring the pants off of you and saying, oh my God, you have to treat this right away. This is really bad infection. Oh my God, this is the worst SIBO I've ever seen. Oh my God.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. And I think I shared this story once before in the last couple of months, but I'll share this again. Keep in mind too, with any testing, we are forming a hypothesis that that test result is relevant for you. And we're forming a hypothesis that that thing that we've identified on the test is contributing to your symptoms somehow. So if we did Candida testing and it came back positive for Candida, we don't know for a fact that Candida is the cause of your symptoms at that point in time. We are hypothesizing that the elevated Candida on that test is accurate and relevant for you. And we're hypothesizing that if we get rid of the Candida, your symptoms will improve. But then we have to test the hypothesis, and we have to see, do you feel better when we eradicate this thing that we identified? And there was a guy, I think I shared this. It was back when I was able to order the GI map. And I think it was last summer at some point. And we ran a GI map on him. And he came back with one of the most outrageous supposed overgrowths of, I believe it was Pseudomonas, I've ever seen. I forget what it was, but I was looking at, the power of the result versus the range. I think his Pseudomonas was 10,000-fold higher than the top end of their range, which is
Oh my God.
bonkers. Absolutely bonkers. And even I was like, woo, okay, we need to do something about that. And we treated it, and we got another new GI map back in, maybe, 2-3 months later, whatever it might have been. And hooray for us, the Pseudomonas was totally gone. We did it. Hooray. Oh, but by the way, he felt absolutely the same. No change in symptomology whatsoever.
Right.
So, are we going to really call that a victory? Are we going to say that the Pseudomonas was really a boogeyman? Or are we going to say that either you had Pseudomonas and it was, for some God unknown reason, not contributing to your symptoms and it was asymptomatic for some reason? Or are we going to question the validity of the test or the sampling method or something? I don't know. But I guess, same thing goes when you get a SIBO test and you start treating the SIBO. If you don't feel better, maybe SIBO's not really the answer, despite what the paper is telling you. If you get stool testing back and your practitioner says, OMG, you have LIBO, and this is your answer, if you don't feel better when you attempt to treat the thing, then that means it's less likely that thing is really clinically relevant for you. So I guess I would just invite everybody to be really curious about any test results that you get, and keeping in mind that it's still the scientific experimentation model. It's still, you've got to be curious and you've got to be kind of playful with it. You've got to try stuff, experiment a bit. No test is going to tell you all the answers. That goes for LabCorp, it goes for Quest, Genova, GI Map, you name it. No test is going to tell you 100% of what you think it is. But now that we've thoroughly demonstrated to the people that we're not super big believers in LIBO as a diagnosis, it's probably dysbiosis, if anything. Let's just talk for a couple minutes about testing for what is a valid test potentially for LIBO or dysbiosis, and then let's get into how one might treat it. And I want to compare that a little bit with, because I've got this question before several times, is how does the treatment plan differ if you have LIBO instead of SIBO, right? So let's start with testing. I just want to say broadly, I think stool testing is going to be more useful for large intestine, colon stuff. You can't diagnose SIBO on a stool test. End of story. I don't care what Diagnostic Solutions tells you. I don't care what your doctor tells you. You cannot diagnose SIBO based on a stool test. End of story. The scientific literature is very clear on this. But if you're looking at things in the colon, aka the large intestine, that's where stool testing has at least some utility. Again, not perfect, but it's at least going to paint you a little bit of a picture. Would you agree with those statements just as a broad kind of takeaway?
Yeah, no, totally. I think that, again, from a stool test standpoint, most of our clients have had some degree of stool test before. It's kind of funny when I have a new client. It's like, what stool test are we going to run? Are we going to run a stool test out the gate? Well, you have 5. So, like, let's review the 5 you have and see if we can garner anything from them. If not, like, let's try something different than you've tried. But yeah, it's funny. Yeah, I think you're right. From a colonic standpoint, the stool test is going to be way more indicative of the microbiome there than anything higher up in the GI tract. Yeah, so I agree. I agree from the testing front.
Yeah, and I do want to say also that they've shown this. I forget what the study was. It was one of Pimentel's reimagined studies. I think it was something like mapping the segmental microbiome, something. But they took samples from multiple sites in the small intestine. Then they took a sample from the colon, maybe 2 from the colon, I forget. And then they did stool sampling. And there were more similarities between stool and colon microbiomes.
Right.
And virtually no similarities as far as like the quantities and the ratios of stuff. There was basically no similarities when you compared it to the small bowel. But even comparing colon versus stool, they're still fairly different. So again, stool testing isn't going to tell you 100% of that clinical picture either. So I want to share that. And again, this is, now we have, again, the accuracy question versus the clinical utility question. I think this more falls into the clinical utility side of things. Even if we're accurately measuring what's coming out, if the stuff coming out is a bit different from what's actually living inside you, how much information are we going to garner from that? That being said, I still like stool testing. I still order it moderately frequently. I don't rely on it 100% of the time, but I think it can be at least a rough idea of where we're headed and what we want to work on. I currently, as of the filming of this, I still am liking Ombre, and I'm still using the BiomeFX a bit as well, especially if I want to measure diversity more accurately. But you know, I don't do a lot of super fancy, expensive stool testing. Honestly, I predominantly stick with the cheapo stuff like Ombre because I think it does a fair job for the price. But then let's say for funsies that somebody's diagnosed with LIBO and they think, honest to goodness, I have LIBO, this is it, or I have some sort of dysbiosis with an overgrowth component to it. And again, the question I've gotten before is, how would the treatment of LIBO differ from SIBO? I will let you open this one, and then I'll throw out maybe a couple of considerations. Do you think that they would be treated somewhat similarly? Where would the differences be?
I think it would be somewhat similarly in my mind. I mean, a lot of, like we were saying in the beginning, they're dysbiosis driven. Both of these are really a lot of dysbiosis. So again, I don't think I would necessarily have huge differences. Now, I think, again, depending on the person and if they had outright SIBO, and I think I might start at the same point typically, like maybe try some gentler strategies, see if we can shift some of the SIBO dysbiosis with things like probiotics, prebiotics, shifting the diet around, working on lifestyle changes, that kind of thing. I think the same thing would go for a LIBO or dysbiosis situation in the colon. Now, I think if someone really had outright SIBO and a lot of those things weren't shifting things, maybe I move on to something herbal or something that might do a little bit of clearing. I might be a little bit quicker to do that with someone that had true SIBO. But again, like there might be a situation where LIBO, it might make sense. Now, I don't think it's what I see a lot in the functional medicine space of, oh my gosh, you had 1 or 2 high markers on that test. Immediately you have to treat very aggressively. So there could be a time and place for doing some antimicrobials for large intestinal imbalances, like a situation where there's an overgrowth of something. But I still think in those cases, I don't know, I think someone would have to be struggling a lot, maybe with a couple different things. Like maybe if they were really sensitive to foods and weren't really making any progress after trying a bunch of stuff, I might think about doing herbals, but I would say that's probably the bigger difference. Now, I think people with outright SIBO might have more symptoms with certain foods. So, depending on how they are when we start from a dietary diversity standpoint, might impact what direction I would go to dietarily. I'd still start at like a broad point, but there could be more value potentially manipulating the diet for a couple weeks and going low FODMAP if they're really struggling, or doing something anti-inflammatory dietary wise, just to kind of reduce inflammation like FODMAP does for a short period of time. I might be more inclined to do that. Now, again, I rarely recommend FODMAP at this point because people are so far along by the time they find us. But, I'd probably be more prone to doing at least a little bit of diet modification or like a modified low FODMAP or full low FODMAP, depending on where someone's at, just to chill out symptoms for a bit if they have SIBO versus LIBO. But again, honestly, I don't see really a major difference between how I would approach the two.
Yeah, I think that you summarized it pretty well. I'll throw out a couple of theoreticals also, but I will share, I think 80-90% of the treatment's going to be the same, regardless of the location. Because again, they're both dysbiosis at the end of the day anyway. I think the overgrowth thing is just a big whoopsie daisy that we've all had. That being said, I agree. I think that it depends on the boogeyman, right? If I got back, I'll paint a picture. I wouldn't trust this on the GI map personally, but I remember I got a LabCorp stool test back. This was a couple of years ago, and the woman had Giardia.
Yeah.
Now, again, I think that the GI map overdiagnoses Giardia personally. That's been my experience with it. But we got a LabCorp PCR stool test back with Giardia, and the woman actually had pretty severe, like diarrhea-based symptoms. So it actually kind of made sense for her. We couldn't figure out the route of exposure, but because she wasn't camping a ton and she wasn't super outdoorsy. Right. But that was something where I was reasonably sure that was an accurate test, and she had severe enough symptoms. It kind of made sense. And so we did launch right into herbal antimicrobials for that specifically. Similarly, I've seen, LabCorp parasite testing or other types of testing come back with a pathogenic boogeyman, something that's genuinely not good. And those are the situations where I might be inclined to do antimicrobials if it's a bad enough boogeyman. If I see something from a lab that I don't think is super accurate or reputable, or if I'm skeptical of that number, or if it's something that's a pathobiont, meaning that you can have some of it in a low amount, but it could become overgrown if it gets the opportunity to do so, So this would be stuff like Klebsiella, Citrobacter, a lot of the proteobacteria phylum members. I don't know if I would go in guns a-blazing. I think it really depends on the presentation for the person. But yeah, I'm generally a bit hesitant to do a lot of antimicrobials. And like you said, it's because we get people who are pretty far down the line anyway. And honestly, most of the people we've seen, they've already tried a million antimicrobials. So how is it going to be any different if I'm the one telling you to take the oregano versus the oregano that you took 3 months ago on your own anyway? Right? Like it just, why would we expect that to be profoundly different anyhow? So I just don't do a ton of antimicrobials for numerous reasons. But I think theoretically, first of all, the small intestine and the colon are both housed in your body, and therefore they are connected to all of the bits of your body, and therefore they can be affected by things like sleep and stress and nutrition and movement and, exposure to chemical-y garbage. So I think that regardless of which one it is, you need to start with those unsexy foundations and make sure that you are laying a good foundation so that your gut and your immune system and your brain and your gut-brain axis and all of the things can actually work. Then when you get into gut-specific stuff, I hypothesize, I don't know if I have proof of this, I hypothesize that people with SIBO, I don't know what that was, I bet people with SIBO would probably respond exceptionally well to things like bile salts and bile-based strategies, because bile is mostly going to be active in the small intestine, and then you reabsorb it in the terminal ileum. So I bet that bile-based strategies would be more effective for SIBO as opposed to colon-based dysbiosis. Similarly, the vagus nerve innervates or controls the gut all the way down to the first third of the colon. The last 2/3 of the colon are not innervated directly by the vagus nerve. They are handled by a different branch of the autonomic nervous system. So direct vagus nerve-based therapies like a TENS unit on the ear or any sort of like vagus nerve stimulation type stuff, that sort of stuff probably would also be a little bit more targeted towards SIBO than LIBO. But again, I think that a lot of the vagus nerve treatments are really just parasympathetic nervous system treatments. And then it would probably encompass the colon to some degree too. I think the really big one that's very specifically vagus nerve and not necessarily the rest of the parasympathetics, I think that would be the TENS unit ear clip treatment. But aside from those things where it would be much more active in the small intestine versus the rest of the gut, I agree. I think that probiotics, prebiotics, dietary strategies, all of those unsexy, unglamorous basics that we've talked about, laying the foundations, getting adequate fiber, getting adequate dietary diversity, 80-90% of this is going to be the same regardless if it's a SIBO or a LIBO type of situation.
Yeah, and I think again it's interesting you bring up outright pathogens. I think are definitely more of a time and place to be aggressive. I think there's been an thinking about things that might be overgrowing, like for instance, Bilophilo-Wadsworthia. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a pathogen, but you said it would be like maybe a pathobiont. So like maybe in certain levels it's fine, but when it starts to overgrow, maybe more of a hydrogen sulfide producer and cause some problems. And I think again, you probably do want to be more aggressive with outright pathogens, which is a really good point. But yeah, I think I like that you described.
If you have chlamydia in your stool sample,
hit it hard, people. You heard it here first.
That's right.
But yeah, I think I like that you bring up bile. I like that you bring up, vagus nerve based stuff. Yeah, I think that all sounds good to me. I feel like we're kind of,
those are the main differences I could think of. I think also it's worth noting when we talk about leaky gut, mostly that's talking about permeability in the small intestine. There is a colon equivalent of leaky gut. I forget if it's just called colonic permeability or what the actual term is, but that may be also like leaky gut based strategies like L-glutamine might be more well targeted to a small intestinal situation versus if you did have leaky or inflamed colon, then I think I would go down more the angle of butyrate, right? And supporting butyrate production, taking butyrate-based supplements, maybe doing butyrate-based enemas. And then you could potentially also start thinking about what therapies have been shown to help people with ulcerative colitis or other forms of colitis, right? Because like leaky colon versus colitis, which is inflammation of the colon, they're similar enough that I feel like we could kind of take some things from that world as well. I'm not saying that everybody who has leaky colon has colitis.
Like a enterogam or some sort of SBI has been...
Yeah.
There's been a lot on IBD for something like that because of maybe some of its binding potential to LPS and some of the more inflammatory compounds. Yeah.
But yeah, those are the only things I could think of that would be really different. Perhaps also, and this is I think this is unproven, but it's hypothesized, and it's definitely promoted in marketing material. When you see delayed release product like ADP, which is a delayed release oregano tablet, I think when you see delayed release, that just means it's not opening up in the stomach and it's making it to the intestines, period. Whether a delayed release product is going to make it all the way down to the colon and do its job in the colon versus is it just going to do its thing in the small bowel, I think that's up for grabs. I think it's kind of implied by the companies sometimes that it'll make it all the way down to like the distal colon somehow.
Right.
But maybe theoretically we could open the door for more of like delayed release and enteric coated products versus taking straight up oil of oregano. Again, I don't know if that, I think that is just going to make it to the intestines at large. I don't know if that's necessarily going to make it to the colon better necessarily. And it's worth noting too, I think that enemas and things like FMT would be particularly promising for more of a colon-based situation, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, getting a fecal transplant from a healthy donor and putting it right into the colon, that's obviously going to have the most profound effects on the colon itself.
Right.
And enemas where you're putting something up there, whether it be, you know, coffee enemas or butyrate enemas or other types of therapeutic enemas, probiotic enemas. Enemas are going to mostly deliver the solution into the colon, probably the distal or the latter half of the colon more so than anything else. So that's also probably a therapy that's more targeted to the colon. But yeah, I don't know if there's a lot of difference treating these two things. I think that what happened is a lot of people had IBS and then along came SIBO and everybody lost their mind collectively. And they were like, oh my God, this is it. This is the root cause. This is the answer. Hooray. This is the end of our suffering. We finally have the answer. Oh my God, hooray. And again, like now I feel like a lot of people have tried going down kind of the SIBO path. And there's a lot of people who are now feeling disappointed in this label, right? Or they feel like they've exhausted all of the things for this particular label. And then, like you implied at the beginning of the call, it's almost like this pivot maneuver where it's like, oh, maybe it's not SIBO, it's LIBO. And they kind of jump to the next thing. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it exists. I think it's all dysbiosis at the end of the day. It's just a matter of what flavor of dysbiosis you have. But
oh my God, yeah.
Do you have any other closing thoughts on the world of LIBO?
I don't. I have a funny story.
Oh, okay. I'm all for it.
So I came up here to get ready for this podcast, and I see this sticky note. I said, Armand, what were you trying to write here? I said, it looks like the handwriting of like someone that had a stroke or something. Like, what's going on here?
Or a doctor.
Right.
Is he secretly a doctor and he's not telling you?
No. But he says, I texted him. I said, what are you supposed to be saying? And I texted him a picture. And before I could send it, he said, I already know what you're going to send. It's a Post-it note. And I said, it looks like the handwriting of someone that might have had a stroke. And he said, damn. And he said, I was telling a person I was writing something down and I'll take care of it, in quotes. But it was just BS. So that's me pretending. And I said, Armand,
well, at least
sad.
you don't have to worry about his handwriting too much.
Right. I was like, okay, so this gibberish makes sense then. But I was like, I had to laugh.
It was intended to be gibberish.
This has been a very Armand-heavy episode, which I feel like
he's
a lovely man, but I feel like we're painting him into a light of gibberish writing and filling up your poop tube to the brim.
Yes, to the brim. Well, that just to me says go big or go home. And
yeah,
I can embrace that kind of attitude.
Yeah, I bet you can. You like that. And you're pretty tall too, so you're going big with your height.
Yes, I was wondering where we were going with that statement. I was curious if there was like a correlation with tall people filling up their poop kits more than the other. This is actually one slight tangent on that, but it's relevant to today's topic. Again, the question of LIBO and increased quantity of bacteria, I think that is going to come up much more frequently on tests that try to quantify the thing. So, for example, the GI map, the GI effects, even things like the doctor's data, and like culture-based stool tests where they say like +2, +3, +4, 0, no growth, etc.
Right, like it's an actual like number versus a ratio.
And that's what I was going to share. So one of the things that I do like about Ombre, and there are other ones, Ubiome used to be similar, but they went under. Biome Site is available in Europe. I believe they're based out of the UK, and I believe they ship internationally as well. But these 16S tests, virtually all of them, to the best of my knowledge, they look at the microbes on a percentage basis. So when you look at the numbers, it's like, oh, I have 0.3562% of the total microbiome is bifidobacteria, or 0.3789 is streptococcus, or whatever it might be. But they're normalizing it based off of the amount of stool because they're giving you the number as a percentage every time.
Right.
And I think that's lovely because, again, even me trying to be super scientific with my ongoing experimentation for my YouTube channel, Gut Microbiome Queen, don't forget it. When I'm poking the poo and I'm trying to collect for an Ombre or a BioMFX or something like that for these experiments that I do, I'm trying to be super exact. And I've even taken out a bunch of my Ombre kits and I've like transferred some of the fluid back and forth between the tubes to try to make sure that all the tubes have about the same level of liquid, because sometimes they send you differing amounts of liquid from the company even.
Right.
But I'm trying to think of these things and be as scientific as possible when I send in my samples. But even controlling it as much as I do, when you look at the raw numbers on an Ombre report, which you could see in the CSV file, they're all over the place. And I think it's just, for a lot of these tests, you get like this little bristle brush thing, or you get like a big long Q-tip, and just the amount of stool that you're picking up is going to differ a little bit each time, no matter how careful you are. So I think that we can get more reliable information as far as the overall ecosystem picture. I think we can get better, more reliable information when it's at least standardized and the information is given to you as a percentage of the total microbiome. So I appreciate that. Now, these
Yeah.
sorts of tests don't look at pathogens, and they don't look at things like candida and parasites. So it's not going to be the end all be all of stool testing. But again, as far as looking at the dysbiosis and the whole ecosystem picture, I think that it's a pretty useful test, especially for the price tag, which is like, I forget, it's like $100, maybe $120.
Yeah, sometimes even cheaper.
I forget. Yeah, if you catch them when they have a sale or a coupon code, it's cheaper than $100.
Yeah, it can be like $70
Can't beat
or
that.
something, $80.
Yeah. So, for what it's worth, so not every stool
I think it's
test is gonna-
impressive. Oh, sorry. I was just
No,
going to say,
you
I
go
think
ahead.
it's impressive that you regrouped and shared that after the story that I just told about Armand and his weird handwriting.
Yeah.
You pulled us back.
Had to bring us home somehow.
Yeah. My brain is
trying to think if I have
mush
any other
today.
Particular
way.
good stories. Yeah. Neither of us got tremendous good sleep last night. So I don't think I have any further stories to share anyhow. But yeah, I think I'm going to wrap us up there. So you can find us on the internet. Amy can be found on Instagram at Amy_Hollenkamp_RD. Very, very good follow on the gram. I'm not super active on Instagram right now, but that will change very soon. I hope I'm going to get back on the gram. And I'm at gut.microbiome.queen. And then my YouTube channel, similar name, it's just called Dr. Dineza, Gut Microbiome Queen. So we're easy to find. Come find us. We have other places where we share a lot of great free information. At least I think it's great. And we will see you right back here for the next amazing episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast. So until then, toodaloo, take care, and happy pooping.